So welcome to this chapter on object-oriented programming. I'm very excited to take you through all of the major concepts, and I've included a lot of modern best practices in this on how to approach an object-oriented programming paradigm by learning the fundamentals from objects encapsulation through to more complex things such as classes and inheritance. Now in this video, we're not actually going to cover anything object-oriented. We're going to be focusing on what we're going to be calling procedural programming. Procedural programming is essentially what we probably learned when we all first started learning to code. We would write a few pieces down, and we would then mutate some variables and have a few functions lying around in no particular order or structure. And the word structure is key here because object-oriented programming is all about having the right structure for our code, or at least learning how to group things and understanding why we should group things. Not just, oh, I can create a class, or, oh, I can create a constructor function, but why are you doing that, and how does it work internally? How does prototypal inheritance work, and much more. So I'm excited about this chapter, and I think this is a really important part for us to understand this procedural programming aspect of JavaScript, and this is something that we probably touched on from the beginning. Now, to demonstrate some procedural programming, we're going to create a constant called cart, and we're also going to create an add to cart function as well, which is then going to take the item that we want to add, and inside the body of the function, we're then going to use a mutable method. So we're in fact going to mutate our array and simply push that item in. So this is the typical code that, as a JavaScript developer who may be new to development entirely, is going to start writing. We don't want to worry about immutable data structures, and we're not really concerned about what they are from day one. Now, the idea behind procedural programming is we have these variables floating around, we have these functions as well with no organization. It could be that we want to organize our code with JavaScript modules, which we now have. It could be that we want to use function closures, or perhaps objects. And objects are what we're going to cover in this particular chapter. So what I'm going to do is also add a remove from cart function, which then accepts an ID of the item that we do in fact want to remove. Now inside the body of this function, we're then going to use cart.splice, and this is then going to take an index followed by a number 1, which will then allow us to remove any item from its particular index and then move forward one place to eradicate it from our array. And I use the word eradicate because we are using a mutable method. This is going to actually change our reference of cart. As we continue through the chapter, we're going to show you some object-oriented ways to also use immutable data structures, which is really exciting as well. Now, before we can continue, we need to, of course, capture our index. The way that I like to do it for this exercise was using array prototype's findIndex method. This allows us to then ask for each individual item, and we can simply return an expression such as does my X ID, so we'll momentarily add an object with an ID property. Does it in fact equal the ID that we just passed in above up here? If it does, then we do in fact get an index. We're not going to worry about if statement safety checking just for now. What we will do underneath is create our first piece of data. We're going to create a hotdog object. I'm then going to give it that ID that we promised. You can use whatever emoji you like. I'm going to use this hot dog that we have available, and we can also give it a name. I'm going to call this one the posh dog, and then we can also supply a price property. I'm just going to call this $3.99. So here we've got our hot dog, our piece of object. Now what we're going to do underneath is in fact call our add to cart because we want to add our hot dog to cart so then that users can check out. Underneath we can sensibly go and say give me the state of the cart because we want to go and log it out. Now if I open up the console, what we're going to do is look at what adding and removing a particular item does from the cart by supplying that particular ID, such as our hot dog here. So again, we can take our console log of cart and just log it out underneath. So really, when we hit save, what we should expect to see is our cart array have something pushed into it, and then immediately we've logged things out, and then we've called remove from cart, and then we've logged it out again. So let's save this out and take a look. So this looks good, and this is actually quite interesting because we have an empty array here, and we of course have our array above with the object inside. Now the interesting piece is when we click on this and expand it, it actually has a length of 0, as does our empty array. So you may be sat here thinking, well, hang on, I can see that there is an object inside of here, but this is in fact because Chrome Developer Tools is updating the reference to our object for us. Our array is being spliced immediately after via our remove from cart method. So in fact, at one point in time, our array does contain our hot dog item. However, because it's removed straight away, Chrome Developer Tools is showing us the actual object. What we could in fact do is use something like a set timeout and just create a small function, and we could use something such as 2.5 seconds, for example, and then we could move our logic inside. So we'll save this out. You can see that we have our item. We can expand this, of course, and you can see that our object is there. Now, because at this point in time, we've expanded things, it's not going to change because we've updated something 2.5 seconds later. So this log is perfectly frozen in time, as you would expect. So you can see that having to go through this process isn't really filling me with confidence. One, that our variables are all over the place and follow no particular pattern or construct. And secondly, we're not following immutable data structure patterns. We are mutating things. And as I mentioned, as we continue, I'll be showing you some really nice things with object freeze so we can ensure our immutability. But I hope for now, what this video gives you is a nice insight into essentially what not to do. And I think this is a great way that we can begin our object-oriented chapter and talking about what our cart is and showing a pretty common example of mutating data structures with objects and arrays. And we also discussed the problems that we might have with mutating things directly. And if you've already watched the functional programming chapter in this course, you may have felt a bit uneasy as soon as we started using these mutable methods, because in functional programming, we should try and stick to the immutable data structure paradigm. By doing so, we can create and return a new object each time, and we can also use things like pure functions. At the moment, this is not a pure function, and it's also accessing members outside of its own scope. So already there's lots of bad practices here. We're going to go through this chapter, we're going to learn a lot more and clean things up, and by the end of this chapter, you're going to have a huge understanding of object-oriented programming, all the principles in JavaScript, and all the modern ways to do things. So I'm excited to take you through it, and let's get started.